The corridors of the Alexandra Military Hospital in Singapore echoed with screams on the afternoon of February the 14th, 1942. Japanese soldiers moved from ward to ward, bayoneting patients on their beds and stabbing medical staff as they worked. Captain Lance Parkinson was in the middle of administering anesthetic when the door burst open. A soldier lunged forward and drove a bayonet through his abdomen. Parkinson collapsed and died less than 30 minutes later. Just weeks earlier, Parkinson had stood next to another young medical officer named Bill Frankland. A senior officer held up a coin and told them to call it. The posting at Tanglin Military Hospital was the prize. The alternative was Alexandra. Frankland called heads. The coin spun and landed. Frankland survived the war. Parkinson, who had dreamed of becoming an obstetrician, was buried in the massacre that followed. Over 200 patients and staff were killed at Alexandra that day. Some were shot, some were bayoneted, some were dragged outside and executed in groups. The dead included doctors, orderlies, and men too wounded to flee. When the killing stopped, the survivors were rounded up and forced into tiny rooms without water or ventilation. Many did not survive the night. To understand how the Royal Army Medical Corps arrived at that moment of crisis, we have to go back to the very beginning. Back to September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, and the Corps faced a challenge it had not seen in a generation. When the war began, the RAMPF was a small peacetime organization. It had just over 2,000 regular officers. Within months, that number had swelled to over 10,000. New recruits poured into depots across the country. Most had never held a stretcher or bandaged a wound. They had to be trained from scratch. John Broome was one of those recruits. He arrived at an RAMPF training depot in England in early 1940, a young man from a civilian background who had never imagined himself in uniform. The days began before dawn. There were lectures on anatomy and first aid. There were hours of stretcher drill on wet parade grounds. There was the discipline of army life, the barking of sergeants, the constant pressure to be ready. Ron Dickinson arrived at the same depot not long after. He remembered the weight of the 1935 training manual, a thick-bound book of regulations and procedures that every recruit was expected to memorize. The manual covered everything: how to apply a field dressing, how to splint a fracture, how to carry a wounded man without causing further injury. Dickinson and his comrades studied it by lamplight, knowing that their knowledge would one day mean the difference between life and death. Training was not only about medical skills. The army demanded physical fitness. Men ran with stretchers across obstacle courses. They practiced loading casualties onto trucks under timed conditions. They learned to work as a team, each man trusting the man beside him. The bonds forged in those training camps would last for years. The RAMPF sent its first contingents overseas in late 1939. They deployed to France with the British Expeditionary Force. They set up hospitals and dressing stations behind the lines. For the first few months, there was little fighting. The so-called phony war gave them time to prepare. But the calm would not last. In April 1940, Germany invaded Norway. The British sent an expeditionary force to counter them. The RAMPF went with them. Medical officers faced conditions they had never trained for. The cold was bitter. Frostbite became as dangerous as bullets. Evacuating wounded men over frozen ground under constant air attack proved nearly impossible. The Norwegian campaign revealed critical gaps in preparation. There were not enough ambulances, medical supplies ran low. The wounded lay in open boats for hours, shivering and bleeding, waiting for evacuation. The lessons were painful but clear. Modern war demanded speed, mobility, and the ability to improvise. The RAMPF would have to adapt fast. By May 1940, the real storm had broken. German forces smashed through the Ardennes and swept across northern France. The British Expeditionary Force was cut off and surrounded. The only escape route was the port of Dunkirk. The RAMPF was caught in the chaos, and the true test of its training was about to begin. The beaches at Dunkirk stretched for miles under a grey and smoky sky. The Germans bombed and strafed without mercy. Medical officers set up aid posts in the dunes, treating wounds with whatever they had. Morphine was given sparingly. Field dressings were applied under machine gun fire. Triage was brutal. Those who could be saved were stabilized. Those who could not were made comfortable. Ford Cayley was a young medical officer with the Suffolk Regiment. He had been issued a revolver and 10 rounds of ammunition, though his work was healing, not killing. On the beaches, he treated men with shattered bones and perforated bowels. The cries for water never stopped. The sand was soaked with blood. He worked until his hands shook from exhaustion. One of the ramp's casualties on those beaches was Private George Mussard, a medical orderly from Hull. He was killed while trying to reach a wounded man. His body was left on the sand as the evacuation continued. Back home in England, his family would spend decades inserting memorial notices in the local newspaper, each one a quiet refusal to let his sacrifice be forgotten. The evacuation was not an orderly process. Ships of all sizes crowded the coast. Destroyers, fishing boats, and pleasure craft all took part. The wounded were loaded onto anything that floated. A man with a leg wound would be carried onto a small boat, then transferred to a larger ship, then taken across the channel to a hospital in England. The chain was fragile. At every stage, there was the risk of attack. One Ramsey sergeant remembered the trip well. A soldier near him was hit by shrapnel in the leg. The sergeant applied a field dressing, while the stretcher bearers kept low. They carried the man across the sand and took cover as a Stuka screamed overhead. When the moment came, they lifted him onto a waiting boat. He made it to a hospital ship and survived. That sequence played out thousands of times during those 10 days. Many medical officers chose to stay behind. They could have boarded ships and escaped. Instead, they remained with the wounded who could not be moved. Ford Cayley was among them. He knew what it meant. He had treated dozens of men who were too badly injured to travel. He refused to abandon them. When the last ships departed, he was taken prisoner by the Germans. On the 4th of June 1940, the evacuation officially ended. Over 338,000 men had been rescued, but thousands of RAMC personnel had been left behind. They became prisoners of war, marched into Germany and Italy, carrying their medical knowledge into camps where the battle for survival would last for years. The early days of captivity were a shock. The men were exhausted, hungry, and stripped of their equipment. They were packed into railway wagons and transported across Europe. The Germans did not recognize them as non-combatants. Medical officers were treated the same as fighting soldiers. They would have to fight a different kind of war now, a war against disease, malnutrition, and despair. For the RAMP's medics who were captured, their work did not stop. The camps were filled with sick and wounded men. Dysentery was rampant. Wounds became infected. The Germans provided little medicine. The captured doctors had to improvise, using whatever they could find. A piece of wire became a surgical instrument. Charcoal from a burnt-out stove became a treatment for stomach complaints. Ford Cayley was sent to a camp in Germany. He had managed to keep his stethoscope and a few surgical instruments. He treated men with pneumonia, dysentery, and infected wounds. The conditions were grim. Food was scarce. The men slept on straw in unheated huts. But Cayley kept working. He had seen the worst of war already. He was not about to give up now. Back in England, the RAMS was rebuilding. The lessons of Norway and Dunkirk were being studied. New equipment was being developed. Training was being improved. The Corps was learning that it had to be faster, more mobile, and more resourceful. The war was just beginning, and the tests ahead would be even harder. The men who had been captured carried the RAMP's motto with them: in arduis fidelis, faithful in adversity. It was not just a phrase, it was a commitment. They would continue to serve, even in captivity. They would continue to treat the sick, the wounded, the dying. The early war years had humbled the Corps, but they had also forged a spirit that would carry it through the long years ahead. By the spring of 1941, the RAMPs had absorbed the hard lessons of Norway and Dunkirk. Men like John Broome had completed their basic training and were now shipping out to new theaters. The next test would come in the mountains of Greece, where German forces were about to strike. The Greek campaign began in April 1941. RAMC units deployed with the British Expeditionary Force, moving into rugged terrain under constant Luftwaffe attack. Medical officers soon discovered that mountain roads made evacuation nearly impossible. Ambulances could not reach the forward positions. Stretcher bearers carried wounded men down rocky slopes for hours at a time. The Germans controlled the skies, strafing medical convoys without mercy. Many ramp personnel were captured when the retreat began. Captain Theodore Stephanides was one of the medical officers serving in Greece. He later wrote about the chaos of the withdrawal. Wounded men were loaded onto any available transport, and some were left behind in field hospitals as the Germans closed in. The evacuation from Greece was a bitter repetition of Dunkirk. The RAMC had gained experience, but they had not gained the equipment or air cover to change the outcome. Many of the medics who escaped Greece would soon face an even greater ordeal on the island of Crete. On the 20th of May 1941, German paratroopers descended on Crete. The battle was savage from the first hour. RAMP's medical personnel, including Private G.D. Jones and Captain Theodore Stephanides, found themselves treating hundreds of wounded under a sky filled with enemy aircraft. The main dressing station was set up in a building near the coast. Within hours, it was overflowing with casualties. Stephanides described the scene as a constant stream of stretchers, with men suffering from bullet wounds, shrapnel, and burns from the bombing. The Luftwaffe bombed and strafed the hospital area repeatedly. Medics worked through the night by candlelight, performing amputations and dressing wounds with dwindling supplies. The Red Cross flag offered no protection from the German pilots. When the order to evacuate came, many Ramsey men faced the same choice they had faced at Dunkirk. Some boarded ships and escaped. Others stayed with the wounded who could not be moved. Private G.D. Jones was among those captured when the island fell. The loss of Crete was a severe blow. Thousands of British and Commonwealth troops were taken prisoner, including a significant number of RAMSC personnel. These men would spend the next 4 years in captivity, their medical skills needed more than ever in the squalid camps that awaited them. By November 1941, the focus had shifted to North Africa. Operation Crusader was an attempt to relieve the siege of Tobruk and push the Axis forces back. The desert presented a different kind of challenge for the Ramsk. The heat was relentless, wounds became infected quickly, and flies swarmed over every dressing station. Water was scarce, and supplies had to be brought forward over vast distances. Field ambulances like No. 132 operated in conditions that tested every man's endurance. The Thomas Splint, already proven in earlier campaigns, was adapted for desert use. It stabilized fractures of the femur and allowed wounded men to be transported across rough terrain without further injury. This simple device saved countless limbs and lives. Casualty evacuation in the desert required careful planning. Regimental aid posts were set close to the front, and field ambulances leapfrogged forward as the troops advanced. The wounded were driven back to casualty clearing stations in trucks that bounced over sand and rock. Operation Crusader eventually succeeded in relieving Tobruk, but the cost was high. The Ramsk had proven it could adapt to desert conditions. The lessons learned about heat, water, and evacuation would be applied in the campaigns that followed. The summer of 1942 brought the Battle of Gazala. It was one of the fiercest engagements of the North African campaign. The British line buckled under Rommel's assault, and the Rams found itself overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties. Field ambulances like No. 132 treated hundreds of men in the desert heat. Medical officers worked without rest, performing surgery in tents that offered no protection from the sun. The wounded lay on stretchers in the sand, waiting for evacuation that often did not come. The German advance was rapid and relentless. Many dressing stations were overrun. RAMC personnel who stayed with their patients were taken prisoner. Captain Norman Rogers of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment was captured during this battle while trying to evacuate wounded men in his truck. Gazala was a defeat. The British 8th Army retreated to El Alamein, leaving behind thousands of prisoners. Among them were scores of RAMC medics who had chosen to remain with the wounded rather than escape. Their captivity would last for years. But the defeat at Gazala also forged a new determination. The RAMC learned to place surgical units closer to the front. They developed better methods of triage and evacuation. These lessons would pay off when the tide of war finally turned at El Alamein later that year. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. Operation Husky was the largest amphibious assault of the war to that date. RAMC field ambulances and surgical units went ashore with the first waves, setting up dressing stations on the beaches under fire. The fighting in Sicily was intense. German and Italian forces defended every ridge and village. Medical officers treated wounds caused by mines, mortar fire, and machine guns. The terrain was as challenging as Greece, with narrow roads and steep hills. For the first time in the Mediterranean theatre, casualties were evacuated by air. Light aircraft landed on improvised strips near the front and flew the wounded back to base hospitals in North Africa. This saved precious hours and saved lives. The cooperation with American medical services was another new development. RAMC units worked alongside U.S. Army medics, sharing supplies and techniques. The combined effort demonstrated that the Allies could work together effectively in the field. Sicily was captured in just over a month. The RAMC had supported the campaign with growing efficiency. The days of being overwhelmed were passing. The Corps was learning to match the pace of modern warfare. On the 3rd of September 1943, the Allies crossed the Strait of Messina and invaded mainland Italy. The fighting at Salerno was brutal. German troops were well prepared, and the beachhead was nearly pushed back into the sea. Ramped field surgical units operated within yards of the front. The surgeons worked around the clock, often by flashlight, as shells landed nearby. Major Tuckett and his team at No. 49 Field Surgical Unit completed 36 hours of continuous operating. They saved men who would have died on the beaches. The terrain in Italy was a nightmare for evacuation. Mountains, rivers, and mud slowed every ambulance. Medics learned to use mules and even handcarts to move the wounded. The Italian campaign would grind on for months, testing every man's endurance. On the 8th of September, the Italian government signed an armistice. For the thousands of Allied prisoners held in Italian camps, this was a moment of hope. Captain Ford Cayley, captured at Dunkirk and transferred to an Italian camp, was among those who seized the chance to escape. Cayley and a companion walked south for 6 weeks. Italian peasants fed them and hid them from German patrols. They crossed the Volturno River near the front line, guided through a minefield by an old woman. They reached American lines, were debriefed, and were soon back in uniform. Cayley would be posted to India, his war far from over. But before the beaches of Salerno, before the fall of Italy, before the war in the Mediterranean reached its turning point, another conflict had already erupted in the east. In December 1941, Japan struck without warning across the Pacific. The attack on the Crown Colony of Hong Kong was part of a wave that hit Pearl Harbor on the same day. The garrison there was hopelessly outnumbered. Its fall would take just 18 days. The Salesian Mission in Hong Kong housed the main medical store for all military hospitals on the island. Doctors of various nationalities, orderlies, and 9 nurses stood ready to treat the wounded. They hung a Red Cross flag at the entrance. For a brief moment, the Japanese combat troops respected it. They accepted the hospital's surrender without violence. But that respect was an illusion. The women were released unharmed, but the men were stripped of their shoes and tunics. Their identification cards, which proved they were medical staff, were thrown aside. They were marched up Mount Parker at bayonet point. On the way, a wounded man crawling toward the dressing station was bayoneted by a Japanese soldier. In a small clearing, the Japanese began the slaughter. Medical staff were bayoneted and slashed with swords. Others were shot as they tried to flee. Captain Martin Banfill, commander of the RAMC unit at the mission, was separated from the others. He was forced to lie on the ground and listen as his men were killed one by one. The death toll included 8 Canadians, a medical officer, 10 RAMC men, and 3 volunteers from the St. John ambulance. Only 3 men survived. Corporal Norman Leith was struck on the back of the neck by a sword. The blade failed to sever his spinal cord. He lay beneath the pile of corpses for hours before crawling away to safety. A week later, an even worse atrocity took place at St. Stephen's College. 200 Japanese troops broke into the 400-bed hospital. They shot the senior medical officer in the head when he tried to surrender. Then they moved from bed to bed, bayoneting the patients. 50 men were killed before the frenzy subsided. A dozen female nurses were gang-raped. Some were murdered, their bodies mutilated. The Japanese government would later claim their troops had come under fire, but the Geneva Convention had been signed by Japan in 1929. The massacre at Hong Kong was a clear sign of what was to come. The same wave of violence rolled south toward Malaya and Singapore. The Japanese advanced through the peninsula with shocking speed. British and Commonwealth forces fell back in disarray. By the end of January, the island of Singapore was under siege. The population of the city swelled with retreating troops and refugees. The military hospitals were overwhelmed. The wounded were moved to Changi Camp on the eastern end of the island. The barracks there had been designed for 3,600 men, but now held 50,000. Medical supplies were scarce. The Japanese refused to distribute stocks of diphtheria antiserum that were stored on the island. Ramps doctors improvised, using blood from recovered patients to manufacture their own serum. The struggle for survival in the camps had begun. The pattern was clear. The Japanese did not respect the Red Cross. They did not respect the Geneva Convention. They saw surrender as dishonor. For the RAMC men now in captivity, the war had entered a new and darker phase. They would spend the next 3 years fighting not only their captors but disease, starvation, and exhaustion. Their medical training would be the only weapon they had. A year later, in February 1943, a different kind of battle began in the jungles of Burma. Major General Ord Wingate led the first Chindit expedition, a force of 2,500 men. Deep behind enemy lines, they marched over 1,000 miles through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Their supply line was airdrops that arrived every 5 days. There was no way to evacuate the sick or wounded easily. Wingate had a reputation for ignoring medical advice. He believed his fighting men should carry the burden, not doctors. He wrote that digging latrines was a waste of labor unless a camp was to be occupied for more than a week. His brigade commanders understood hygiene better, but the damage was done. On the first expedition, rates of malaria were devastating. The supply of mepacrin, the anti-malarial drug, was simply not enough. Men grew painfully thin. The physically exacting nature of the campaign burned through their body fat. Starvation began to kill them slowly. Bill Aird, the medical officer with 5 column, noted that 60% of those captured by the Japanese later died, primarily because they were already starved before capture. The sick and the wounded were frequently left behind with a small supply of food, water, and morphine. Each officer carried letters in different languages, explaining to local villagers how to care for the wounded. The medics hoped the Burmese would help. Some did. Many could not, as the Japanese presence was too strong. Over a third of the men who went into the jungle on Operation Longcloth did not return. They were lost to the enemy, to disease, or to simple starvation. Those who did make it back were emaciated. The condition acquired a name, Chindit syndrome. It was characterized by long hair, dirty fingernails, weight loss of 2 stones or more, skin sepsis, diarrhea, and a haunted look. The men were intelligent and disciplined, but their bodies had been pushed to the breaking point. One officer described them as a spent force. Wingate himself did not survive to learn the lessons of his first expedition. He was killed in a plane crash in March 1944. Colonel William Officer took over as Deputy Director of Medical Services for the Chindits. He found that the late commander had not been medically minded. Cooperation between the fighting force and the medics had been resisted at every turn. Officer set about changing that for the second expedition. A year after the first Chindit expedition, in February 1944, the Battle of the Admin Box erupted in the Arakan region of Burma. The Japanese surrounded a small administrative area defended by the Indian Army's 7th Division. Inside the box was the divisional main dressing station, staffed by men of the 66 Indian Field Ambulance. The station was tucked in the corner of the perimeter, shaded by jungle foliage. The medics believed the Red Cross would protect them. At 9 o'clock on the evening of February the 7th, the Japanese attacked the dressing station with machine guns and rifles. The medics pleaded with them to stop. A voice from inside the station called out, "Don't, for Christ's sake, don't!" Then a single shot. Then silence. British troops nearby knew what was happening but could not intervene. They were ordered to stay in their trenches to avoid shooting their own men in the dark. Captain John Robinson was inside the station that night. He was a 28-year-old psychiatrist from Cambridge. The Japanese pulled him from his patients. They told him they were in a hurry and could not afford to take prisoners. Then they executed him. In total, 35 medical staff and patients were killed by stabbing, shooting, or slashing. The killing was not tactical, it was cold policy. Lieutenant Salindra Mohan Basu of the Indian Medical Corps was also captured. The Japanese demanded to know how many patients and officers were in the station. Basu refused to give military information. He was told he would be taken to Rangoon to join the Indian Independence League, a nationalist group allied with Japan. As he was being led away, a British mortar shell landed nearby. In the confusion, the Japanese prepared to execute their prisoners. Basu protested, "We are Red Cross people. We are doctors and hospital workers. We have nothing to do with actual warfare." The Japanese ignored him and opened fire. Basu was hit in the ear. He reached into the blood of a dead comrade, smeared it over his own face and head, and went limp. The Japanese left him for dead. He survived. His testimony would become part of the war crimes record. The massacre galvanized the Allied troops inside the admin box. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Cree of the West Yorkshire Regiment described the fury. He said it made every man determined to get the better of the Japanese. The battle continued for a fortnight. The British and Indian troops held the box. It was the first decisive Allied victory in the Far East. A template had been set for the defeat of the Japanese army in Burma. In March 1944, the second Chindit expedition, Operation Thursday, began. It was the second largest airborne invasion of the war. 20,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers were flown into Burma. The plan was to establish fortified blocks deep behind Japanese lines. The medical support was better than the first expedition, but it remained contentious. Wingate was gone, but his influence lingered. Colonel Desmond White commanded the medical support for his brigade. He had recommended that each column of 400 men have a medical officer and 11 orderlies. Wingate had rejected this, arguing it would make the column too unwieldy. Instead, 2 medical officers and 2 orderlies per column would have to suffice. The fighting troops were trained in basic medical care to compensate. This was not enough. In May, the brigade established a fortified block called Blackpool. The Japanese attacked in force. Hand-to-hand fighting raged along the wire perimeter. The stench of dead bodies became overwhelming. The main dressing station filled with casualties. Medical supplies began to run out. Sheets of parachute cloth were used as bandages and splint retainers. A lull in the fighting allowed supplies to be dropped by air, but the respite was brief. The Japanese brought up heavy artillery. 300 shells exploded inside the perimeter in a single hour. The Chindits' 4 field guns were knocked out. The enemy crept onto the airstrip. The main dressing station was overwhelmed. Brigadier John Masters faced 2 agonizing decisions: withdraw before his men were overrun, and determine the fate of those 2 injured to be moved without sacrificing the safety of the others. 19 men lay on stretchers. 1 man had a shell remove the entire contents of his stomach. Between his chest and pelvis there was a bloody hollow. Another had no legs and no hips. Another had no face. Desmond White examined each of them. He told Masters they had no chance. He gave his word of honor. None of them would last 2 hours. Masters ordered White to administer the remaining morphine to those still conscious. Then he summoned his stretcher-bearers. White assembled the medical team and led the remaining patients north through the attacking Japanese. The walking wounded were placed in sections under NCOs. Others were carried up a muddy slope. Enemy snipers lined the only usable track. Bullets ripped through White's medical pack, but the party pressed on. After 3 hours of shelling and machine gun fire, they reached a ridge. The Japanese did not follow. White was later awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership and gallantry. In April 1944, the Japanese launched their own invasion of India. They aimed to break through the mountain passes at Kohima and Imphal. The Battle of Kohima became one of the most bitterly fought engagements of the war. The road to India was a narrow track through steep jungle-covered hills. The Japanese surrounded the British garrison at Kohima. The fighting was house to house, trench to trench, sometimes hand to hand. RAMC field ambulances and field surgical units worked in extreme conditions. The jungle heat was oppressive. Rain turned the ground to mud. Casualties poured into the dressing stations day and night. One medical officer described operating by flashlight, while mortar shells landed within yards of the tent. The wounded who could not be evacuated were treated in the open, under fire. The greatest enemy was not the Japanese, but the mosquito. Malaria stalked every camp and every column. The 14th Army, under Field Marshal William Slim, made suppression of malaria its highest priority. Every soldier was ordered to take his daily dose of mepacrane. The medical officers enforced it. Men who failed to take their tablets were disciplined. The difference between the Allied and Japanese armies in controlling malaria became one of the most important factors in the defeat of Japan. One of the front-line weapons in that fight was a simple tablet of quinine. It was small, bitter, and could mean the difference between life and death. For soldiers in the jungle, each tablet was a physical link to a chance at survival. The quinine was doled out by medical officers in daily doses, pressed into the hands of men already exhausted. It was a simple piece of pharmacology, but it kept tens of thousands of men healthy enough to fight. The Battle of Kohima turned in May. The British garrison held out long enough for reinforcements to break through. The Japanese supply lines collapsed. They ran out of food and ammunition. The survivors retreated into the jungle, leaving thousands of dead behind. The siege of Imphal was also lifted. The attempted invasion of India was over. It was the largest defeat the Japanese army had ever suffered. The cost was immense. The 14th Army had over 17,000 casualties at Kohima and Imphal. Thousands more were evacuated with malaria and other diseases, but the victory was the turning point of the Burma campaign. From that moment on, the Allies advanced. The Japanese never again held the initiative in Burma. The Ramps had played a central role in making that victory possible, by keeping the army healthy enough to fight. The advance continued through 1944 and into 1945. The jungle gave way to plains, then to the Irrawaddy River. Rangoon fell in May. The Japanese army in Burma was shattered, but the fighting was not yet over for the Ramsey. Thousands of Allied prisoners of war were still in Japanese hands. Their liberation would be the final task of the campaign. Captain Paul Adler, a medical officer who had written home months earlier about the need to train orderlies in weapons, did not live to see that day. He had been killed on November 5, 1944, while tending a wounded man on a bridge. The Japanese were being pushed back after their defeat at Kohima. Adler came under sniper fire and was struck down. The jungle offered no safety behind Red Cross brassards. He was 28 years old. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The longest campaign of the British and Commonwealth forces was over. The war had begun for the Ramsey in the Far East in December 1941. It had ended 4 years later, not with a surrender on a battlefield, but with the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The news reached the prison camps slowly. For Captain Leslie Ellis, the end came without ceremony. He was at a camp in Thailand when the Japanese guards began burning papers. The senior sergeant was called to the Japanese commander's hut. He returned and said simply, "The war is over. You are now free men." Ellis walked to the local market with his meager savings to buy food. It was several days before any significant movement toward freedom took place. The Ramk had lost many men like Adler and Robinson, men who had volunteered for the most dangerous work. The official history of the campaign would later state that the control of malaria was one of the most important reasons the Japanese were defeated. It was a vindication of everything the medical corps had fought for. But the victory was not only about malaria, it was about the willingness to treat the wounded where they fell, to improvise when supplies ran out, and to endure captivity with dignity. Victory over Japan Day brought release to the survivors of the prison camps. For those who had been captured in the fall of Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Burma Railway, the war was finally over. The liberation began the slow return home, a journey that would take weeks or months for many. The Ramk had sustained the Allied fighting strength through 4 years of relentless campaigning in the most difficult environment on Earth. The longest campaign was over. Japan's surrender in August 1945 ended years of captivity for thousands of Ramk men scattered across the Far East. But that liberation had been purchased slowly, month by month, inside prison camps where disease and brutality were as deadly as any battlefield. The ordeal had begun in February 1942, when Singapore fell, and over 50,000 British and Australian troops marched into Japanese captivity. For the medical corps, the surrender was not just a defeat. It was the start of a new war fought with bamboo needles, boiled river water, and sheer human will. In the chaos that followed the surrender, the wounded were moved to Chengji, a barracks complex built for 3,600 men. It now held 50,000. The Japanese provided 5 ambulances to move 9,000 patients. The senior Australian medical officer, Lieutenant Colonel Glyn White, scrounged extra trucks and convinced the Japanese the transfer would take 3 weeks instead of 1. He saved thousands. Inside Changi, conditions deteriorated fast. Dysentery swept through the overcrowded huts. The hospital at Roberts Barracks had no electric lighting, no sewage disposal, and a limited water supply. Flies bred in the slit trenches being used as latrines and invaded the wards, carrying infection from wound to wound. By late March, there were over 5,000 admissions for dysentery. Captain Bill Frankland ran one of the newly opened dysentery wards, working through the stench and the rattling of bedpans. Diphtheria struck next. The Japanese had ample supplies of antiserum stored at the old Tanglin Hospital, but refused to distribute it. Captain Hugh de Wardner took blood from recovered patients and made his own serum. He injected himself first to prove it was safe. The pain vanished within hours. Wardner's improvised treatment saved dozens of men who would otherwise have died. It was the first of many medical improvisations that would keep POWs alive through years of captivity. In late August 1942, a new camp commander arrived at Changi. General Shinpei Fukuye demanded that every prisoner sign a pledge not to attempt escape. The men refused, knowing the Geneva Convention gave them the right to try. Fukuye ordered them all into the Selarang Barracks Parade Square, a space designed for 800 men. Nearly 17,000 were crammed in. The Japanese shut off the water supply to the toilets. Captain Harry Silman, a medical officer attached to the 9th Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, loaded his medical stores onto an ambulance and drove into the square. He found 2 water points for the entire area. Each man was allowed 1 gallon per day for all purposes. Washing and shaving were forbidden. An open sewer ran past the veranda where officers were sleeping, the stench immediate and the threat of malaria constant. Silman had 1 small room for medical inspections. Only urgent cases could be seen. Routine dressings were impossible. An Australian hospital tent was set up, and a surgeon performed an emergency appendix operation on the first night. Flies multiplied in the accumulating filth. Men dug latrines 16 feet deep. Sappers made seats from the doors of the billets. The death count began to rise. Dysentery spread through the packed square. Silman treated what cases he could with the few drugs he had. The Japanese threatened to move more men into the already overcrowded space, which would have created a medical catastrophe. Lieutenant General E.B. Holmes, the senior British officer, faced an impossible choice. On the 3rd day, he gave the order to sign the pledge. The men filed out of the square, exhausted and humiliated, but alive. The Selarang incident broke the spirit of organized resistance in Changi. Men understood now that the Japanese would use starvation and disease as weapons, but the experience also hardened the resolve of the medical officers. They had seen what happened when hygiene broke down, and they knew that survival depended on discipline. Silman and his colleagues organized sanitation teams, dug proper latrines, and enforced strict rules about waste disposal. It was the beginning of a medical resistance that would save thousands. In 1943, the Japanese began demanding laborers for a railway project in Thailand and Burma. The line would stretch 258 miles through jungle, cutting through rock and crossing rivers, built by hand. Thousands of POWs were sent north from Changi. They went willingly at first, told they would find better food and lighter work. They found neither. The railway became a death sentence for men, already weakened by months of captivity. Cholera arrived with the monsoon. The disease struck fast, turning a man's body to water in hours. The Japanese, terrified of infection, ordered the sick to be separated from the fit. Hospital camps were set up across a valley from the main work camps, and the guards kept their distance. The sick received reduced rations. The fit pooled their food with the sick, sharing equally, knowing that anyone could be next. Captain Harry Silman treated cholera with river water boiled in stolen kerosene tins. He had no proper intravenous equipment. He took bamboo shoots, sharpened them to a point, and fitted them to lengths of stethoscope tubing. A tin can suspended from a bamboo rod served as the reservoir. The needle went into a vein, held in place with a strip of bandage. It was crude, but it worked. Men who would have died within hours survived the night. The Japanese guards would not enter the cholera wards. They stood at the door, masked and fearful. Silman and his orderlies worked inside, surrounded by the dead and the dying. The smell was appalling. Twice a day, the guards counted the living. If a man died during the count, his body stayed where it lay until the next count. Men who had been comrades hours before became corpses stacked alongside the living. The railway took its toll. Tropical ulcers spread from insect bites and leech wounds, eating into muscle and exposing bone. Silman performed amputations with a hacksaw blade, knowing the alternative was death from toxemia. One of his patients was a former Batman named Ronald Windmill, a young driver who begged to have his leg taken off. Silman did the operation, but Windmill died 3 days later, too weakened by months of starvation to survive the wound. He was 22 years old. While the men in Japanese camps endured the railway, those held in Italian camps experienced a very different captivity. Italy was a signatory to the Geneva Convention, and conditions there were tolerable. Prisoners received Red Cross parcels. The guards were often elderly or indifferent. Medical officers could move between camps and even perform surgery in local hospitals. It was not freedom, but it was survivable. On September the 8th, 1943, the Italian government announced an armistice with the Allies. The prison camps erupted. In Campo PG-49 at Fontanelato, the commandant cut a hole in the fence, and 500 officers marched out in companies before separating into the countryside. Captain Norman Rogers was among those who walked out that morning. He had been captured at Gazala in North Africa over a year before, serving as medical officer to the 4th Royal Tank Regiment. Rogers teamed up with Captain Arthur Jones, and the two men began walking south. They crossed the Apennine Range over rough sheep tracks, avoiding villages and German patrols. Italian peasants fed them, clothed them, and let them sleep in barns. The Germans were rounding up former prisoners, and anyone caught helping them risked execution. The peasants helped anyway. When Rogers asked why, they said it was an act of humanity the church would have wished them to undertake. After 6 weeks of walking, Rogers and Jones reached the Volturno River, near the town of Venafro. The Germans were blowing up bridges and power stations, tearing up railway lines, demolishing houses to block roads. The front line was somewhere ahead. They entered the village of Raviscanina, 37 miles north of Naples. It was deserted. Barbed wire and rubble filled the streets. Chickens wandered freely. They had reached no man's land. An old woman saw them from a doorway. She warned them not to walk up a certain alley. The Germans had laid mines and tripwires along it. A small boy had been killed there. She led them through the hazard one by one, then pointed them toward the American lines. Shortly after, Rogers and Jones walked into a group of American GIs, receiving their bread and mail. They were fed, searched, and debriefed. Then they were sent home. In April 1945, the war in Europe was in its final weeks. British forces advancing into northern Germany discovered a camp called Bergen-Belsen. It was not an extermination camp in the industrial sense, but a place where people were starved and worked to death. When the first Ramsey units arrived, they found a landscape of horror. 10,000 unburied corpses lay scattered among the huts. Thousands more were dying. Typhus was everywhere. The men of No. 11 Light Field Ambulance entered the camp on April the 17th. Major D.T. Prescott described the scene as one of utter chaos. Dead and dying lay everywhere. Prisoners in blue and white striped uniforms shuffled aimlessly or collapsed where they stood. Inside the huts, hundreds of people were crammed onto shelves without mattresses. In many bunks, the dead lay beside the living, and the living lacked the strength to push the bodies out. The Ramseys set up a hospital in a cavalry barracks, 2 miles from the camp. At its entrance, a large stable was converted into what they called the human laundry. Men in anti-typhus suits, dusted with DDT powder, entered the camp in ambulances and brought out the most seriously ill. Their clothes were stripped and burned. German nurses, conscripted from nearby towns, bathed the patients and dusted them with more powder. Wrapped in clean army blankets, the survivors were moved to makeshift wards. Every day, between 650 and 750 patients passed through the human laundry. Major Prescott set up a dispensary that supplied drugs for 13,000 patients a day. He had a German army pharmacist working under him and a camp inmate who spoke 5 languages. Field Marshal Montgomery visited and was sprayed with anti-louse powder like everyone else. The BBC's Richard Dimbleby came and reported what he saw. The world began to understand. The cost to the Ramsey was not light. 20 men from number 11 Light Field Ambulance contracted typhus. One man was killed when a German fighter plane strafed the medical tents in broad daylight despite the Red Cross markings. The men worked for a month inside the most unhygienic conditions imaginable, surrounded by the most virulent disease known to man. When the work was done, the huts were burned by flame-throwing tanks. The survivors were moved to proper hospitals. The camp was gone. The memory did not fade. The war in Europe had its own earlier trial. In the spring of 1942, the Royal Army Medical Corps faced a very different kind of test on the coast of France. Captain David Peyton had been transferred from the Orkneys to join No. 2 Commando in air. His first impression of his new comrades was mixed. Some of them were ruffians, men who could not stand the discipline of a regular regiment. Many of them, though, were brilliant men. Peyton trained with the commandos in Scotland through the winter. In February, the unit embarked for Falmouth. A large parcel arrived, a papier-mâché model of the docks at Saint-Nazaire. The men studied it for weeks. Peyton ordered a consignment of sulfanilamide powder and transferred it to 50 small sweet bags donated by a local shopkeeper. He knew that infection, not the bullet itself, often killed a wounded man. On the evening of March 27th, Peyton spotted a little blue light from a British submarine, guiding them toward the Loire estuary. The moon broke through the clouds now and then. The destroyer HMS Campbelltown, packed with explosives, pushed ahead. The commandos followed in small craft. When the German challenge came, the British flashed back the correct code. For a moment they were through. The boat ahead of Peyton's was supposed to seize the Old Mole. It never made it. German fire cut the men down before they reached the pier. Peyton's craft pulled up against the stonework. He touched the structure with his hand. Bullets struck the stone inches from his face, sending cement dust into his eyes. He thought, "Do not let me be hit in the face." German soldiers began rolling bombs off the pier onto the deck of the boat. The commandos kicked them back into the water. Peyton saw his men dancing about, kicking at what he thought were stones. One soldier shouted that they were bombs, not stones. Peyton started kicking too. Below deck, the wounded were already accumulating. He went down to attend to them in the dim light. Peyton refused to sew up any wound. Everyone was cross with him for that decision. But he knew that bits of khaki and cloth and bullet fragments were embedded in the flesh. Sewing that up would cause a festering infection. The wounds had to be cleaned properly at a hospital. His refusal to suture, under fire and in chaos, saved lives that night. The raid cost 169 men killed. Peyton made it back to air with just 16 fit commandos. 2 years later, the scale of the war in Europe had grown beyond anything the men of Saint-Nazaire could have imagined. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, would require the largest amphibious medical operation in history. Penicillin was now available for the first time in combat. By order of Winston Churchill, the wounded in Normandy would receive the new drug before civilians back home. It would dramatically reduce infection and amputation rates. Captain Ian Campbell had been training since September of the previous year with the 7th Beach Landing Group. Exercise smash at Studland Bay in Dorset was watched by King George VI, Churchill, Montgomery, and Eisenhower. Campbell remembered Churchill looking depressed, walking among the men, giving the V sign and saying good luck. 2 weeks before the invasion, the unit was sealed in the New Forest. On a beautiful spring day, they sunbathed until someone looked up and said, "There is Churchill." Captain John Forfar, medical officer of No. 47 Royal Marine Commando, had advance notice of his role. His unit would operate at the western edge of Gold Beach, next to the Americans landing on Omaha. He had liaised with the United States Army Medical Department long before June the 6th. On June the 3rd, he boarded the SS Victoria and set off for France. The 24-hour delay caused by weather created seasickness and anticlimax. Forfar's landing craft hit a mine 5 miles off the beach. He was thrown into the water with his heavy medical rucksack. One of his orderlies was killed instantly. Forfar swam for the shore, pushing his sinking rucksack with one hand. Machine gun bullets rattled against the sides of landing craft around him. He made it to the beach at 9:30 in the morning, soaked and exhausted, his medical equipment lost. The commando unit had already lost 70 men. Forfar pressed inland with his unit. They marched 12 miles behind German lines to take the port of Port-en-Bessin. Along the way, a German officer was shot from his horse. 13 commandos were wounded by sniper fire. Forfar found himself conflicted. His instinct was to stay and treat the wounded, but his duty as a commando medical officer was to press on with the fighting troops. He left the wounded in the care of local civilians and continued forward. Private Lacey Tingle parachuted into Normandy with No. 224 Parachute Field Ambulance. Tingle was a conscientious objector. He had joined the REMC on the understanding that he would never be required to carry a weapon. He would treat any wounded man, British or German, with the same care. On the afternoon of June the 7th, in the village of Douville-en-Orge, Tingle and a group of paratroopers were surrounded by the enemy. Company Sergeant Major Lord was wounded and taken prisoner. Tingle was presumed killed. His body was later buried as an unknown soldier. In 2018, his grave was identified and rededicated with a headstone bearing the inscription from John 15, verse 13. On September the 17th, 1944, the largest airborne assault in history was launched. Operation Market Garden aimed to capture 5 key bridges in the Netherlands and open a route into Germany. The final bridge, at Arnhem, was entrusted to the 1st British Airborne Division. The division was supported by the 181st Air Landing Field Ambulance and other RAMC units. Opposition was believed to be light. 2 elite German panzer divisions were waiting. Corporal David Jebbett of the 181st Air Landing Field Ambulance flew in a Horsa glider towed by a Dakota. He landed near Wolfhise, outside Oosterbeek. The main dressing station was set up in the Schoonord Hotel. Casualties accumulated quickly. Jebbett was assigned as an anaesthetist for the surgeons. Amputations were performed using saws that had been issued for prisoner escape purposes. They were little more than hacksaw blades. After a week, the number of patients had grown to over 1,200. The hotel was hit repeatedly by mortar fire. Medical teams worked under horrific conditions. Glass and plaster fell in profusion. Bomb and shell fragments whistled through the windows. Colonel Graham Warwick, the senior medical officer of the division, later wrote that he could not speak too highly of the bravery shown by the wounded. There was never a murmur of hysteria. Warwick realized that the position was becoming untenable. On September the 24th, a week after landing, he was sent to a dressing station occupied by the Germans. Accompanied by a Dutch interpreter, he was taken to German divisional headquarters. General Blaskowitz agreed to evacuate all British wounded and to stop firing toward the dressing stations. The German staff gave Warwick a bottle of brandy and allowed him to return to his own lines. The evacuation of the most seriously wounded began under the truce. Over 2,000 wounded men had been treated in the perimeter. Many were moved to German hospitals, where surgeons like Captain Alexander Lippmann-Kessel operated on them. Brigadier John Hackett, commander of the 4th Parachute Brigade, had 14 holes in his small intestine from a mortar fragment. Lippmann-Kessel saved his life. Hackett later escaped with help from the Dutch resistance. By the time the survivors withdrew across the Rhine, the medical units had lost everything. Warwick himself escaped captivity with the help of the Dutch underground. He reached Allied lines in February of 1945. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his work at Arnhem. The battle had cost the Airborne Division over 7,000 casualties. The medics had remained with their wounded until the very end. The winter of 1944 brought a new crisis. On December the 16th, the German army launched a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge caught Allied forces off guard. RAMC units attached to American formations found themselves dealing with a new kind of casualty. Frostbite joined gunshot wounds as a daily reality. Medics worked in bitter cold, treating men who had frozen in their foxholes. The fighting was dense and confused. Forward medical posts were often surrounded. Ambulances traveled roads that were under constant shell fire. The wounded were brought in by any means available. Jeeps, trucks, and even sleds were pressed into service. Medics worked non-stop in field hospitals, heated only by small stoves. The cold made blood transfusions difficult. Plasma had to be warmed before it could be used. Psychiatric casualties, now called battle fatigue, became a growing concern. Men who had fought for months without a break began to crack under the strain. The RAMC had established a small network of psychiatrists, 1 per corps, spread across 6 general hospitals. At the field ambulance level, advanced dressing stations would pass these cases to a field dressing station. Mild sedatives, warm drinks, a clean bed, and sleep brought wonderful changes to many. It was recognized that a man could be a very good soldier for months, and then suddenly break. There was a finite limit to courage, different in each individual. The treatment evolved. It was found that men recovered and returned to their units much sooner if the period of rest was carried out within the sound of gunfire. Sending them further back to a tented hospital only delayed their return. By January of 1945, the German offensive had been blunted. The Allies began to push back, but the fighting remained bitter and the cold remained deadly. On January the 23rd, the ramp suffered its greatest loss of the campaign. Lance Corporal Eric Harden, a medical orderly with No. 45 Royal Marine Commando, was about to perform an act of courage that would earn him the only Victoria Cross awarded to a member of the Corps during the entire war. Harden was 32 years old, married with 2 children. He had been a butcher in civilian life and a sergeant in the St. John Ambulance Brigade. Conscripted into the army in 1942, he had grown restless with home service and volunteered for the commandos. He trained at the Achnacarry Depot in Scotland and was posted as a medical orderly to 45 Royal Marine Commando in January of 1944. He had already survived the Normandy landings. On the freezing night of January the 23rd, the commando was pushing forward near the village of St. Eustburg. Able troop became trapped in an ambush at a crossroads. 4 men lay seriously wounded in the snow-covered fields. A previous rescue attempt had failed when a clearly marked medical jeep was destroyed by German fire. All its occupants were killed. The wounded men lay exposed to the cold and the enemy. Harden did not wait for orders. He went out into the open under intense mortar and machine gun fire. He crossed 120 yards of open ground to reach the wounded men. He bound up the wounds of 3 of them. He dragged 1 Marine back to safety. On the way back to the aid post, he was hit in the side by a bullet. He continued working. 2 more rescue attempts were made, one using tanks, another with a smokescreen. Both failed. Against orders, Harden arranged a stretcher party carrying a white flag with a red cross. Again the Germans fired on the clearly marked medical party. The man being carried was killed. Harden went out a 3rd time. He was bringing in Lieutenant Corey when he was hit in the head. Harden was killed instantly. His body lay in the open until the next day. For his 3 separate rescue missions under fire, each one more dangerous than the last, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. The citation described his complete disregard for his own safety. His gravestone bears the inscription, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends." By April 1945, the liberation of Bergen-Belsen confronted RAMS personnel with horrors. Further east, on April the 29th, troops from the British XXX Corps liberated the camp at Sandbostel. What they found was so horrific that even the most hardened soldiers were physically revulsed. Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks visited the camp and was sick in a corner. The floor of the first large hut was strewn with emaciated figures in striped pajamas. Many of them were too weak to walk, but they raised themselves and gave a pathetic cheer. Major Hugh McLaren, a surgical specialist with No. 10 Casualty Clearing Station, arrived at Sandbostel on May the 6th. He found conditions he described as the most chaotic slum dwelling on Clydeside, made to look luxurious in comparison. The camp hospital consisted of 1 hut, with a dark central corridor, and 20 small rooms leading off it. Each room contained shelves where prisoners lay in close-packed rows, 40 to 60 men per shelf. One section was called the horror camp. It held about 8,000 political prisoners. The mass of dead, dying, and befouled humanity had received only occasional cartloads of turnips or potatoes. Men with the strength to do so fought mad scrambles for the scraps. McLaren noted that many of the survivors were curiously apathetic. Starvation had affected their brains. 50% were so depressed that the news of liberation brought little or no emotional reaction. McLaren set up a human laundry similar to the one at Belsen. German women were conscripted to wash the survivors on stretchers, dust them with DDT powder, and wrap them in clean blankets. They were then transferred to the casualty clearing station by ambulance. In the first 4 days, the staff lived through a nightmare of constant demand. Each patient needed at least 5 large cupfuls of water per day. With 60 patients in each hut, a single medical orderly could not keep up. McLaren observed the strange behavior of men who had lived with death for so long. One skeletal survivor beckoned him to his bedside and pointed to the man in the bunk above. He asked if the man was dead. McLaren examined him and confirmed that he was. The patient smiled faintly and said thank God. He then detached the ground sheet he had used to protect himself from the droppings of the dead man above. McLaren spoke with the German women who had been conscripted to work in the camp. Most expressed the view that they could have done little to stop the horror. One woman, Fraulein Bittner, gave a different answer. She said the Führer must have had good reason to create the camp. When McLaren asked if she condoned the killing of 3 million Polish Jews, she replied that the National Socialist Party had decided the policy was best for Germany. Field security arrived with her name on their wanted list hours later. McLaren later wrote that he shuddered to imagine what might have been. He pictured this wilderness of barbed wire and huts on the Stocky Moor in Scotland or on Hampstead Heath. The skeletons would then have been British. His unit did not crack under the strain, he believed, because every man was given full scope to use his own initiative. It was remarkable, he noted, how few orders had to be given. The Germans were astonished at this. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. For the Ramsey, there was little celebration. Private Jim Wisewell, who had treated 466 casualties in a single day during the Battle of Caen, spent VE Day in Delmenhorst. He tried to analyze his feelings. He remembered that Siegfried Sassoon had spent Armistice Day in 1918, sobbing and cursing, thinking of the dead. Wisewell did the same. The work of the Ramsey did not end with the ceasefire. The camps still held thousands of dying men. The human laundries continued to process survivors. Field hospitals treated the wounded of both sides. The medics who had fought through Normandy, Arnhem and the Bulge now fought a different battle. They fought to restore life to men who had been systematically reduced to skeletons. The Ramp had played an indispensable role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. From the beaches of Dunkirk to the horrors of Belsen, the Corps had adapted, improvised, and endured. They had treated the wounded under fire, in the desert, in the jungle, and in the prison camps. They had saved tens of thousands of lives, and in the final months of the war, they had borne witness to the absolute worst that humanity could inflict upon itself. The men who served in Europe were not the same men who had signed up in 1939. They had learned lessons that no training manual could teach. They had seen comrades die and had continued working. They had treated enemy wounded with the same care as their own. They had maintained the traditions of the Geneva Convention, even when their enemies did not. The Red Cross brassard on their arms was not a shield. It was a statement of purpose. The war in Europe was over, but for many the war would never truly end. The images of Belsen and Sandbostel would not fade. The faces of the men who had died under their care would not be forgotten. The Ramp had earned its motto, in arduis fideles, faithful in adversity. They had been faithful to their calling, to their comrades, and to the wounded of all nations. The cost had been heavy. Thousands of Ramp men had been killed or wounded. Thousands more had spent years in captivity. The Corps had lost men like George Mussard on the beaches of Dunkirk, men like Paul Adler on a bridge in Burma, men like Eric Harden in the snow of Holland. Each death was a life given so that another might live. The Corps could ask no more of its men, and its men had given everything. As the guns fell silent across Europe, the Ramp turned to the next task. The prisoners of war in Japanese camps still needed to be freed. The wounded of all nations still needed care. The survivors of the concentration camps still needed to be brought back from the edge of death. The war in the East continued for 3 more months. The Corps would be there, as it had always been, faithful in adversity. The Red Cross flag that had flown over Belsen was a symbol of everything the Ramp had fought to preserve. It represented the belief that even in the midst of hatred and slaughter, there was a place for mercy. The men who had worn that flag on their arms had carried it through the darkest years of the century. They had not failed it. Bill Frankland arrived in Liverpool on October 13, 1945. He had been away from England for 4 years, 3.5 of them as a prisoner of the Japanese. The docks were crowded with returning soldiers, many of them thinner than when they had left. Frankland carried no luggage, only the worn uniform on his back. The air felt cold and clean, a sharp relief after the humidity of Singapore. He stood on the gangplank and looked at the grey English sky. At the demobilization center, a clerk asked if he wanted to see a psychiatrist. Frankland refused without hesitation. He said, "No, I want to see my wife." The words carried the weight of years of separation, of beatings and disease and starvation. He would not spend another minute on anything that delayed his return home. They handed him his papers and sent him on his way. There was no transport available to take him to London, so Frankland walked 5 miles through the streets of Liverpool to a nearby village where a vicar was letting returning prisoners use his telephone. Each step was a small act of defiance against the years of captivity. When he reached the vicarage, his hands were shaking as he dialed the number. The phone rang, and then he heard her voice. His wife, whom he had not spoken to in years. The sound of her voice brought a flood of emotion he had kept buried through the long imprisonment. They spoke for only a few minutes, but it was enough. The war was truly over. Frankland rebuilt his life with quiet determination. He returned to St. Mary's Hospital in London and began a new career specializing in allergies, a field where he would become one of the world's leading experts. He chose not to speak about his wartime experiences for many decades. Dwelling on the past, he believed, led only to depression. He bore no hatred toward his captors. He was a Christian who had been taught to love, not to hate. John Broome was demobilized in early 1946, his service with No. 2 Light Field Ambulance finally at an end. The unit had been broken up, its men scattered to new postings across Germany. Broome watched as the old desert rats of the 7th Armored Division went their separate ways. He wrote to his mother about the difficulty of leaving the men who had become his family. The army had taught him about people, about life, about himself. Ford Cayley returned to England on a dull autumn day. He handed in his uniform and drew a demob suit, 20 clothing coupons, and a book of ration tickets. He was 30 years old and weighed about 7 stone. At Middlesex Hospital, doctors diagnosed him with hookworm and threadworm, the legacy of his years in captivity. He began a new career as a registrar at St. Stephen's Hospital, working almost immediately after his return. The terrible dreams and the fear took a long time to fade. Frank Turton went back to Sheffield and returned to work at the Brightside and Carbrook Cooperative Society. The anatomy and physiology he had learned during the war stayed with him, a quiet knowledge that shaped how he understood the world. He decided against pursuing a career in medicine. He wanted to return to what was familiar, to the ties of family and community that had sustained him before the war. The 6 years away had reinforced the importance of those bonds. Leslie Ellis spent months recuperating at a British General Hospital in Bangalore after his liberation. He suffered from sinusitis and amoebic dysentery, the lasting effects of his captivity. He wrote long letters to his mother, filling in the 3.5 years of his life that she had known nothing about. He spoke of the friendships he had formed, the cruelty he had witnessed, and the bitterness he still carried. England seemed a strange place now, but he was grateful to be alive. The men of the Royal Army Medical Corps returned to civilian life carrying different burdens. Some, like Stanley Cross, used their medical knowledge to help their neighbours, treating cuts and assessing loose teeth in the streets of Hull. Others struggled to readjust, finding the pace of peacetime life slow and unfamiliar. But nearly all of them carried something from the war, a deeper understanding of human nature, a capacity for endurance, and the quiet knowledge that they had saved lives. The Ramsay had served from the beaches of Dunkirk to the jungles of Burma, from the deserts of North Africa to the horrors of Belsen. Its men had treated the wounded under fire, improvised medicines from bamboo and river water, and endured years of captivity with courage and dignity. Tom Smiley, bayoneted at Alexandra Hospital, was awarded the Military Cross and survived the war. David Peyton returned from the St. Nazaire raid to command a parade of just 16 survivors. Ian Campbell and John Forfar, who treated the wounded in Normandy and beyond, both survived and returned to civilian life. Norman Rogers, who escaped from an Italian prison camp and walked 6 weeks to freedom, was repatriated and served again. Harry Silman, who fought cholera with bamboo needles and boiled river water, survived captivity and returned home. Hugh de Wardener, who improvised diphtheria serum from the blood of recovered patients, continued his medical work after the war. John Robinson, the young psychiatrist, was executed by the Japanese at the admin box. Desmond White, who led his wounded men through enemy lines at Blackpool, was recommended for the Victoria Cross and received the DSO. Salindra Mohan Basu, who feigned death in a massacre of medical staff, survived and testified against his captors at war crimes tribunals. When the war ended, they went home not as heroes seeking recognition, but as men who had done their duty. The motto of the Corps was, In arduis fidelis, faithful in adversity. They had earned those words with every life they saved and every patient they refused to abandon. If you have family stories from the Second World War, or memories passed down from a parent or grandparent who served in the medical services, we would love to hear them in the comments below. Every story is a thread in the larger history, and we read every one of them. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to support our work, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Thank you for listening.